On behalf of SDPI team, I welcome you to this online panel discussion on informal sector during the COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges and the opportunities. This panel discussion is part of SDPI's 23rd Sustainable Development Conference, which is a 4-day conference, and this is basically its third day. Its theme for this year is Sustainable Development in the Times of COVID-19, and this conference started off on 14th December 2020. For this session, we are grateful for the support and collaboration from the World Bank South Asia Chief Economist Office, and especially Dr. Robert Baer. So let me just start off by giving a brief introduction to the topic of discussion today. COVID-19 induced a lockdown which brought businesses in Pakistan to a standstill, and the government of Pakistan came up with initiatives and a package of around $6.5 million to facilitate businesses for their losses, and these businesses included micro, small, medium, and large enterprises. But unfortunately, the informal sector was not included in most of these schemes. The informal sector, which is estimated to be around 30 to 50% of the formal GDP and provides employment to around over 60% of the workforce, and of course it also affects the formal sector in a way that most of the vendor industry and the subcontracting industry is informal till now. We had a chance to hear from the topmost economic thought leader, Dr. Pasha, 2 days back on the same conference, and he estimated that 70% of the informal sector has been displaced, resulting in job loss, and around 40% of the informal sector jobs lost were basically women. And just with this introduction, with this recessive trend in economy, we need to find ways to help both the formal and the informal sector of the economy. And this particular panel discussion of this conference was aimed only to discuss these challenges and the opportunities here, and what role can different stakeholders play. I would like to furthermore introduce our August panel. The panel chair here is Mr. Hashim Raza, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Authority. Welcome, sir. We are also joined by Dr. Siddharth Sharma from the South Asia Chief Economist Office of the World Bank, Mr. Rafi Khan, who is an economist and research analyst at the World Bank Islamabad office, Mr. Abdul Qadir, who is an independent development sector practitioner, Samar Hassan, who is the CEO and co-founder of Epiphany Private Limited, and last but not the least, Azima Awais, who is an architect by profession, is a postgraduate student at the University of Stuttgart, Germany. So just briefly explaining the sequence here, we will be having two presentations at the start. We have a presentation from Ms. Azima Awais, and then from Dr. Siddharth Sharma, and of course that will be followed by remarks from Mr. Rafe, Samar, and Abdul Qadir Saab, and finally our panel chair, Mr. Hashim Raza, will be giving his concluding remarks, and afterwards we can have a Q&A session. Some housekeeping announcements. I would request all of you to keep your mics muted when you're not speaking. Our audience can post their questions in the chat box. You may find me prompting you in the interest of time keeping, and the meeting will be recorded with your permission, and the video will be posted online on the SDPI YouTube channel so that all of you can revisit the discussion and also share in your networks. The session is also live on Facebook, and our social media team is actively posting the key points on all social media platforms under the hashtag SDC2020. The recommendations from this session will be provided to all relevant economic ministries and departments of the government at federal and provincial level for future policy planning. The proceedings of today's meeting are expected to be inputs to very important endeavors of the government. First, in the mid-year review, and second, post-pandemic economic recovery strategy. So, thank you. With this introduction, I will now hand over to Azima Oves for her brief presentation. Thank you. Azima, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Uh,
Rao. Do you hear me now? I'm just gonna play my presentation while I will speak along. Do you guys see the screen?
yes, we can see the screen kindly. Continue.
Okay. So, hello and salam everyone. First, I would like to share. Sorry. Um, do you all hear me? I just want to ask.
Yes,
Okay.
we can all hear you.
Hello and salam everyone. First, I would really like to thank the panel organizers for giving me this chance of sharing my research, which I conducted during actually the first initial 6 months of the COVID 19 pandemic. In this presentation, I will be talking about economic reforms and their impacts on urban development, especially taking Karachi's informal textile industry sector as the case study. The presentation will focus on four main points of this panel. Number one is the challenges of pertaining to the informal economic sector in Pakistan, and that in the time of COVID 19. Number two is the need of structural changes in legislative, policy, and administrative sectors of the state institutions to address the challenges of informal economy. Number three is the role of provincial government that they can play to support informal economic sector. And number four is the role and importance of development partners, either regional, local, private, state-led, and their alliance with the government to improve the overall understanding around the informal economy in Pakistan. Before presenting the thesis for my research, I am briefly going to share the life stories of two people from Karachi. The first one is a woman by the name of Sakina. Here she is helping in her husband's house-based garment manufacturing unit to complete the orders of clothes for winter season. Due to lockdown because of COVID-19 pandemic, their manufacturing unit was closed for 2 months and the migrant labor was sent to their homes in rural Sindh. Now, after the lockdown was lifted in June, they are trying their best to complete the pending and also new orders in a short time. Hence, she is helping among the returned labor and other family members in the manufacturing unit. Well, Sakina is a 52 years old woman who calls herself a housewife by profession. She shifted to Karachi from the rural Punjab with her family when she was just a baby during the times of land reform legislation and emerging industrialization in Pakistan. Her parents shifted to Karachi looking for better living and work opportunities. After coming to Karachi, she completed her education till 5th standard in school and later started learning sewing from her mother. She worked as a sewer and also in the quality control division department of a textile factory in site area, where she met her husband, and after they got married she left work. Her husband also have worked his entire life in different textile factories of site area. Later, after gaining experience, he spent his life savings to set up a home based garments manufacturing unit in Metroville. Metroville is an adjoining middle to low income residential neighborhood in Sidetown. Metroville was previously administered as part of the Sidetown, which was disbanded in 2011. Currently, they are living in a ground plus three-story house in which ground floor have a mezzanine floor which have the manufacturing unit set up, and the upper two stories are for the residential use of Sakina's family. This manufacturing unit is not registered with any state institution, yet we cannot call it illegal due to its nature of work, but only informal, mainly because of its spatial setting and also because not being able to fulfill the requirements to register with government institutes. For my This is the in the video you can see their manufacturing unit. This is the ground floor and the stairs go up to the second floor. Well, this is the second story is of Abdul Majid, who is a businessman and runs his small medium enterprise of garments manufacturing unit in site area. Abdul Majid have his own garment store in Dubai, where he supplies directly garments from his factory alongside other orders from different brands. Abdul Majid went to Dubai in early 90s looking for better work opportunities. He worked in Dubai for more than 20 years and came back to Pakistan to set up his own garments factory. In 2015, he set up his unit on a rented floor area in a factory inside town, with initially only 10 workers, which have now grown to almost 50. He recently have gotten his factory registered with the FPR and Karachi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Before the registration, he had to export his goods under the name of another registered enterprise for which he had to pay extra money as well, and there was no security or assurance of safe transfer of his goods. Sakina's husband manufacturing unit also works for Abdul Majid's factory because whenever there is a big or excessive order for Abdul Majid, it is subordered to the smaller enterprises, mostly informal home-based units. Since Sakina husband do not have direct access to the international market and can only cater to the local market because he is not registered and don't have means to reach the foreign clientele. Other than suborders from the SMEs or paying money to brokers or contractors. Well, this was the story of two people from Karachi's population of roughly 15 million, out of which sources estimated 45% work in the textile sector, which makes one in every five households. My thesis established from the hypothesis that urban development is driven by economic development. Dissecting further into this, we need to understand the basic core sectors catered by these disciplines. Economic development is a process of targeted activities and programs that work to improve the economic well being and quality of life of a community by building local health, diversifying the economy, creating and retaining jobs, and building the local tax base. On the other hand, urban development is the planning of physical arrangement of these same activities, which draws up plans for the tangible positioning and conditioning of a community, which, for example, covers infrastructure for housing, education, health, market, justice, solid waste management, water provision, energy provision, etc. And this cycle is simultaneously shaped by the domestic, regional, and global political shifts, technological advancement or innovation, and the economic shift happening in the larger sequence of events. To anatomize and contextualize the hypothesis further into the reference frame of Karachi city, my main statement is to develop an understanding of socio-spatial disparities, which are resulted by the socio-economic friction, political interest, and global economic forces, which further divided focus into two research statements as follows: impact of economic reform, which contribute in the socio-spatial distribution of urban space in Karachi, and second is how the city is being shaped by political incentives and foreign investment for development. Well, the main learning objectives are to understand the linkages first between the formal and informal economic sector and how they are shaping the city. We can understand by studying the various theories of development used in analyzing and explaining processes of change in developing countries. And to contextualize it more, we need to understand the literature on the post colonial state in order to analyze the contemporary Pakistani state. But the main last 2 points are to develop insight into the process by which state and capital combine to build infrastructure, promote industrialization, and provide services in urban areas, especially. And the last point is to develop a clear understanding of the local impacts of economic crisis and reform on cities in Pakistan, especially that of Karachi. The last 2 points are much more important. To situate Karachi and in its industrial activities, I drew uh, this map and took from one of the reports, which says, excuse me. In this map, we can see Karachi have four main industrial zones located near the port and have access to the port. And to these industrial zones, we have around these industrial zones, we have major residential areas located. To go further, I and narrow down the research, I tried to see the
Azima,
linkages between the
I would request you
informalization of
to
textile
wind
industry
wind
sector.
it up within
Um,
1 minute,
I
please.
drew three diagrams. This one shows the linkages between the formal and informal textile industry sector, um, its manufacturing and production system through orders and suborders, and specifically the role of broker and contractor among the informal entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs to reach the international market. Well, this diagram shows the second diagram shows the production of labor and placement of them in the urban space, especially those of migrants coming to city for work and looking for residence near workplace. The third diagram is the transformation of space because of economic activities and change in land use due to lack of infrastructure provision and particularly the absence of adequate transport infrastructure. To conclude my research, the reason behind the ongoing decline in the urban infrastructure and more informalization of textile industry, I want to show this mapping of site town, which was my case study area. The orange line you guys see, the bordering is the site town, and the yellow border is of the site industrial zone. Site town contains 9 more residential neighborhoods. The red part is the highest informal activity active zone. To focus it more and look at it uh, more, it's this is the site industrial state, and the red highlighted part is the economic zone, which is mostly informal and and this we can call perhaps the buffer zone between the formal industrial estate and the residential state. And in this diagram, we can see the blue highlighted area is Abdul Majid's factory unit in the site industrial town, which I mentioned before. And the green highlighted area is Abid Ali's residential
Azima,
unit,
we are really short on
which
time.
lies under the buffer zone of
I would
industrial
request you
estate and
to,
residential estate. The distance between them is less than 1.5 kilometer.
Azima, I would request you to wind it up.
And
We are really short on time.
to conclude, I want to say the factors that are very much in play for the informalization of industry are primarily related to the liberalization, regional and local conflicts, the declining law and order situation in the city, and perhaps the power outages. These factors, if continued or not addressed, can create more distress and further informalization of the industry, specifically that of textile industry. The research indicates here that there is a clear need of reforming in the zoning bylaws to allow mixed uses for the low income groups to work and live in the same area, and this will help in supporting the broader city planning as well. For example, reduce traffic congestion. A structural reform is also needed in the energy sector to exempt these areas from power outages, and more than anything, documentation of informal industry is very much needed to bring about a just system. Thus, a social and political investigation and research is also of seminal importance to be taken into account to understand and analyze such a multi-layered pattern of urban informal economic processes. In this diagram, we can see
Azima, are
where
you
my
able to
cursor
hear
is.
me?
This is Karachi, and the other part is Dhabeji Special Economic Zone. Dhabeji Special Economic Zone is a priority project under CPAC and BRI, and it have entered the second phase of development. About this, I want to conclude the CPAC project under China's BRI is promising to bring in foreign direct investment, especially in the industrial sector, rather than building the new economic zones far away from the cities, which will require a huge amount of investment in infrastructure building, first of all. The existing industrial zones should be given first priority to urban development. It will also help to bring in private foreign investment to these existing industrial zones where the machines are already running and the labor is available. Regarding the current situation of textile SMEs and their decline, there is also a lack of trade policy of effectively reduce the cost of trade, and it has played a huge role in discouraging the potential exporters. Therefore, despite the potential and competent workforce, many possible businesses are unable to reach the international market. What is clear is that the informalization of industrial activities and their spread into lower income settlements is likely to continue as the crisis unfolds, especially this COVID-19 pandemic unfolds, representing a clear priority area for urban policy. Um, a further research is also required through the lens of economic development. A re-evaluation of Karachi's urban development policies and governance is also required in accordance to the new reforms as to include and incentivize the most important economic sector and use the potential to contribute in economic growth, and also the employment sector to have a more inclusive and economic sustainable economic development. Well, thank you everyone for listening to my presentation. That was it. Open to Mr. Rahat.
Thank you, thank you, Azima. You went overtime by more than 6 minutes, but I hope the rest of the panelists will be better focused here. Next, I'll like to call Dr. Sharma up if he can share his presentation.
Not
Dr.
hear
Sharma,
you.
Dr. Sharma,
Thank you.
yes, kindly share your screen.
Sure. Thank you, Ahad. I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know if it's working. Okay.
Yes, we can share. We can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you to SGPI for allowing me to present the main findings of our of the World Bank report. So we produce a biannual report called the South Asia Economic Focus, and the fall 2020 edition focused on the topic of COVID-19 and informality. Um, as you all know, South Asia, including Pakistan, has a very large informal sector. More than 80% of employment in general is informal. Workers in the informal sector lack access to formal employment protection programs, to social assistance programs and social insurance programs. So they are more vulnerable to shocks. At the same time, they have low levels of earnings, low savings, so their ability to cope with shocks on their own is also limited. So there's a lot of concern, understandably, about how the COVID crisis has hurt the informal sector. And this is why we decided to focus on informality in our fall edition of the report. Let me give you the main messages right away. So we do a lot of analysis of micro data, both using simulations to project what would be happening, and also using some data sets where we are actually able to observe what happens after COVID hits. And what we find is that the COVID impact, as expected, is biased against informality, but it has also exacerbated informality. So first of all, you can think of the informal sector as consisting of those who work for a wage in informal jobs. So they don't have proper contracts. And so these workers were the most susceptible to job loss in the early phase of COVID-19. And secondly, the second part of informality is what is called informal self-employment, right? Really small micro enterprises. So what we find is that they also suffered, but in some sense, the self-employment was a kind of fallback option. And so many workers, both formal and informal, turned to self-employment. And finally, looking at income, the impact of this crisis has fallen on the bottom half of the income distribution, on those who are informal. Now, the digital economy is a kind of silver lining in this crisis, because now many of us are able to work from home. We are now right now doing a conference over Zoom. So what is this? How has this helped the informal sector? Our analysis suggests that that it has a lot of promise for the informal sector, but in the short run, it's not going to yield huge benefits from to the informal sector, and it's not going to help in the short run in the crisis. Our main takeaways in terms of policies are that the region has done a very commendable job of expanding relief policies, but two long-term challenges have really become sort of exacerbated or have been highlighted by this crisis. The first is how do you expand social insurance to cover the so-called informal sector or the missing middle? And second, how do you design real effective growth policies for informal firms? Let me present the results. Now, first of all, one of the channels in which the informal sector is more vulnerable, besides the fact that it doesn't have access to formal protection mechanisms, is the fact that it is also in more exposed sectors. So sectors such as retail, transportation, restaurants, accommodations, and food, right? These are the sectors that have a lot of high face-to-face intensity. And they have been hit quite badly in the COVID crisis, both because of the lockdown and also because of changes in people's behavior, right? Social distancing. Now, it turns out that these sectors, which are shown in red in this chart here, are quite intensive in informal employment. So one channel through which the informal sector is being hit is because it's concentrated in these exposed, vulnerable sectors. So in this chart, I'm just showing you the incidence of employment in the affected sector. So how much employment is vulnerable because it's in the affected sector by income. So we've arranged households from lowest to highest income, and for each income group, we are showing how much of the employment of households in that income group is in the affected sectors, and so how is vulnerability distributed by income. So as you can see, there are the people from in affected sectors are actually found throughout the distribution. So they're not just poor, but they're also middle income, and some of them are also rich. Those who are informal are really in this low to middle zone of the income distribution. So it's not as if only poor, really poor informal people are vulnerable, but also a middle income informal people. We used models now to simulate the impact of the crisis because as of writing the report, and I believe even now, we didn't have access to post-COVID data, household level representative data from most countries in South Asia. So we used a model to simulate the impact on the economy in different sectors, and then we did a micro simulation of the types of individuals on whom we would expect the impact to be really intense, right? So these simulations suggest that it's low and middle income informal workers from urban areas who are particularly vulnerable to job loss. So in these two charts, what we are showing are our expected rates of newly unemployed, the exposure to unemployment as a result of the crisis, and how it's distributed by income and by formality and informality. And you can see that the highest rates of expected unemployment are among low to middle income informal workers in urban areas. So the left chart for urban, the y-axis is actually is bigger than the one on rural. So even though they look the same, in fact, the rates are much higher in urban areas. We also simulated the change in welfare, which is the change in real consumption, and I'm showing it for Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. Our simulations again suggest that the biggest fall in welfare is likely to have been experienced by low and middle income informal workers. So looking at Pakistan, which is number C here, these slopes are upward sloping. What this means is that richer households experienced a smaller expected decline in welfare. But they're negative. So everyone is seeing a decline in welfare, but it's less so for richer households. And secondly, the blue line is above the red line. The red line is for informal households. So at every point in the income distribution, it is informal households that are more that are expected to see a bigger consumption decline. And this again speaks to their higher vulnerability. I'm also going to show you very quickly some results from data from India, which is actually a survey that was collected post-COVID. So we actually have data on what was happening there, and it seems to confirm these projections. So I'm going to first show you what happens in a normal pre-COVID period. So here we are tracking the same people, the same households over time between August and December 2019. So it's a 4-month period pre-COVID, right? So on the x-axis, we first categorize people who were employed in August 2019 and those who were not working or unemployed and out of the labor force in 2019, in August 2019. On the y-axis, we show what happened to them in terms of employment or not being employed by December 2019, 4 months later. So you see there's a lot of stability. Most people who were employed in August were also employed in December. Most people who were not working in August were also not working in December. Now look at the COVID period. It's a lot of flux. So now we are looking at, we are starting in December 2019 and then tracking the same individuals in April 2020. This is when there was a national lockdown in India. So now pre and post COVID, you see a huge difference. So those who were employed, only about 60% were still employed in April 2020. So a lot of job loss. And now here we break it up by formal versus informal. So pre-COVID, I'm now showing you August to December 2019, pre-COVID period. And on the x-axis, the 3 bars, they categorize individuals according to whether they were in formal employment, in informal employment, or not working in August 2019. And then on the y-axis, we are showing what happens to them by December 2019. And so if you look at the middle bar, this is individuals who are in informal employment in August 2019. And you see that most of them are orange, meaning they are still informal in December 2019. So again, this is a picture of stability. Most formal employees remain formal, most informal remain informal, most of those without jobs remain without jobs. Now look at the COVID period from December to April 2020, right? So as you can see now, among those who were formal, about 40% are still formal, they're blue, right? Then about 30% or so have actually become informal. So that's the orange there in the first bar. And then
Mr. Sharma, may I request if you can wind it up in 1 minute?
Sure. And then you see that on the top, there's a lot of informality. But the red zone, the informality, is actually higher in the informal sector. So there were transitions into self-employment, and the actual job loss was higher in the informal sector. I was talking about the digital economy. Well, what we basically show in the report is that it has a lot of promise for the informal sector, but access to digital technology and the capability or the education to use it is very limited for the informal sector. So in the short run, it's going to be hard to use it to improve productivity in the informal sector. So in terms of policies, so I'll just have 2 more slides, and then finish after that. So our first main message is that expanding the reach of social assistance programs is really important. And so in Pakistan, as in most of South Asia, the COVID-19 response has been to expand existing social assistance programs. These are means tested, so they tend to sort of reach poor people and those who have fallen into poverty. Now, as we just saw, a lot of the vulnerable informal sector may not necessarily be poor in the beginning. So it's not clear if this missing middle is being reached. So there's a need to expand these programs very quickly. In the long run, there's a need to redesign social protection systems so that they become more inclusive. And you can do this by leveraging technology and by big data. And there are very important initiatives already underway in Pakistan in this respect. And you need to design a system that doesn't just work for the next crisis, but also for future crises. So you need a flexible system. Our second big challenge is to improve the low productivity of the informal sector. As you can see here, despite decades of fast growth on all of South Asia, the informal sector is still very big. So I think there's a deep-seated structural problem here. And our analysis and the research suggests that the firms where informal workers work are actually quite heterogeneous, and they face different types of constraints. It could be access to capital, it could be skills, it could be markets. It's very important to identify the right constraint. So I'll end now with this, our thinking on the policy space, right? A big picture kind of thinking. So right now we need to think both in terms of time frame, short-run relief, and long-run building better, and targets workers and households and firms. So in terms of what do we need to do about workers and households, In the short run, the relief is about expanding social assistance and making sure that this missing middle is also reachable. Right? In the long run, we have to build better, more universal social protection systems and expand social insurance. So it's not just about supplementing income, but also giving insurance from shocks. And we have to close the digital gap in access. For firms, in the short run, the relief is all about giving them liquidity support so that viable firms don't die just simply because they don't have liquidity. In the long run, we have to address deeper constraints in capital, skills, and productivity. I hope this was helpful, and I'm going to end here.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. I think both these presentations have given us a very good insight into the subject. And now I will come to the panel discussion, starting off with Mr. Rafi Khan from the World Bank Islamabad office.
Thanks a lot, Ahad. Can you see me and can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, phenomenal, perfect. So I'll try to stick to the 10 minutes timeline that you've given us. So Siddharth talked about informality in all of South Asia, and Siddharth, I think, took a slightly different perspective than the perspective I'll be taking. Siddharth focused on informal employment in South Asia more generally. I'll be talking about informality in Pakistan, and not just informality in Pakistan. I'll also be taking a more insular focus on informality vis-a-vis firms that are operating in the private sector in Pakistan. So there are two parts to my remarks today. In the first half of my remarks today, I'll be talking about the nuances of informality. I'll be talking about its contours, its scope, and also its heterogeneity in Pakistan. And I think this is a particularly important point, primarily because of the sort of bearing this heterogeneity and the scope and the contours of informality have on both policy formulation and policy implementation insofar as the informal sector is concerned in Pakistan. In the second half of my remarks today, I'll be talking about what the government can do. And when I talk about what the government can do in terms of policy formulation, I'll be talking both about what the government can do, the government of Pakistan can do to support firms that are operating in the informal sector survive the COVID crisis. And in addition, I'll also be talking about what the government can do in the long term to tackle informality with a view on increasing productivity, with a view on increasing efficiency, and with a view on unlocking broad-based economic growth. So jumping right into it, let me start off by talking about nuances of informality in Pakistan, which will lay the foundation for the remarks we'll be giving in the second half. On the nuances, informality has been cast as an anathema in Pakistan. Analysts and commentators have gone as far as saying that informality is everything that's wrong with this country, it's everything that's wrong with this economy. Informality leading to low revenue mobilization, informality leading to an uneven playing field, informality leading to low productivity and efficiency is, according to these individuals, what has impeded competitiveness and economic growth in Pakistan. But the question is, how accurate is it? How big of a problem is informality in Pakistan? There's no denying that it's a problem. There's no denying that firms that operate in the informal sector do not contribute to the government in the form of taxes and revenues. There's no denying that firms that are operating in the informal sector predominantly, for the most part, are not particularly productive, and as a result of which competitiveness and economic growth has been hurt at the macroeconomic level in this country. But there is a flip side as well, right? The flip side is that what we know, based on a cursory review of firms that are operating in the informal sector in Pakistan, what we know is that some of these firms can be quite dynamic, they can be quite resilient, they can also be quite agile. What we also know is that the informal sector employs a big chunk of the labor force in this country. And if you didn't have an informal sector, then the unemployment rate in Pakistan would be considerably higher than what we have at the moment. So there are pros and cons. But what exactly is it that we know about the informal sector in Pakistan? The high level answer is not a lot, because not a lot of research has been done on the informal sector in Pakistan. What we do know is that the informal sector is large. What we do know is that it's most certainly not a marginal part of the economy. It's an integral part of the economy. It's absolutely massive. And I can tell you, I can give you some high-level statistics. What I can tell you is that the vast majority of the firms that are operating in the private sector in Pakistan are operating in the informal sector. Close to 92% of all the enterprises in Pakistan are operating in the informal sector. And this is based off the definition that's used by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, which says that any enterprise that has less than 10 employees is considered an informal enterprise. And when you reconcile this definition with the economic census, which I understand is quite dated, it's 2 decades old, but when you reconcile this definition with the economic census, the number you get is almost 92% of all the enterprises are operating in the informal sector. What we also know is that close to 70 to 72% of all the labor in this country is working in the informal sector. And this number actually goes up to 89% if all those individuals who are currently employed in non-wage jobs are considered to have informal jobs. So almost 90% of all the labor in Pakistan is working in the informal sector. That's an absolutely massive number. What we also know, based on a review of the labor force surveys, that informality in Pakistan has a gender lens. And what I mean by that is we know that labor force participation in Pakistan is quite low. It stands to around 28 or 29%. But what's more disconcerting is the fact that the vast majority of these very few women are working in the informal sector. Close to 90% of all the women in Pakistan, working women in Pakistan, are working in the informal sector. We know this because we know that 54% of the women who are working in Pakistan are in non-wage jobs. And we know that close to 70% of all the women who are working in Pakistan are working in the agriculture sector. So it's absolutely massive, and there is something seriously wrong with the way the economy is structured right now. If you want to empower women, if you want to bring them into the fold of the formal economy, you need to start with the informal sector. But the point that's particularly important, this is perhaps the most important point that I will be making today. The point that's really important is that there's a lot of heterogeneity when we're talking about the informal sector. And this is not necessarily just true for Pakistan. This is true for informality more generally around the world. Informality in Pakistan, at least, has been cast as this monolith. It's considered binary, it's considered black and white, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And this is precisely why policy formulation and policy implementation and policy effectiveness has been so weak in Pakistan when it comes to the informal sector. What we know based on research that's been done by the World Bank around the world is that there are three different types of informality. You have fiscal informality, you have legal informality, and at the same time you have labor informality, which I've already delved into, so I'm not going to speak about that. But legal informality is it's the concept which we're most familiar with, and it's a concept that makes its way into the policy discourse in Pakistan. Legal informality basically means that a firm is not registered with institutions that it's supposed to be registered with. Fiscal informality is a slightly more nuanced concept, and fiscal informality basically means that firms could be registered, but they're not paying their due share in taxes and other fees to the government. So, it's a fine balance. What we also know is that there are degrees of informality, right? So you could have a firm that's registered at the municipality, that's registered at the local council level, that's registered with the Chambers of Commerce, but it's not registered with FPR. So the question is this firm formal or is this firm informal? We don't know, which is why I think you need to have a slightly more nuanced perspective on what informality is in Pakistan. And there's a third concept. When you're talking about firms that are operating in the informal sector, you need to be cognizant of the fact that these firms have a very different, it's a wide range when it comes to their skills and capabilities. There are firms which have the capability to formalize, and at the same time, there are a lot of firms which simply do not have the capacity. Research work that's been done by the World Bank in Sri Lanka, for instance, shows that almost a third of the enterprises that were operating in the informal sector had the capacity in the first instance to formalize. 2/3 didn't even have the capacity. And I would imagine the number is very similar in Pakistan. We don't have research, which is why I'm quoting this research from Sri Lanka. But I would imagine that the reality is very similar in the sense that, not a lot of firms have the capability or the skill set to actually formalize in the first instance. So this was just some context setting on what the informal sector looks like in Pakistan. Jumping into the second part of my remarks today, and I think, that's where the meat lies, on what the government of Pakistan will do in terms of policy formulation and policy implementation. I think when you're talking about government policies, you're talking about two distinct things. As a starting point, we're talking about what the government can do to support the informal sector in surviving the COVID crisis and weathering the storm. And then the second thing the government, especially in the long term, the government needs to do, and the government has been thinking about, is what it needs to do to engender formality, to tackle informality. Let me start off with the first point, though. Let me start off by talking about really quickly about what the government can do to support the informal sector survive the COVID crisis. As a starting point, I think what we need to internalize, the fact that we need to internalize and the fact that the government needs to internalize is that informality just exacerbates the challenges of supporting the private sector. What it does is your fiscal policy, your monetary policy gets diluted. A firm that is not paying taxes, a firm that is not connected to the financial sector, for instance, cannot be supported by your traditional fiscal and monetary measures, which have been rolled up around the world and also in countries like Pakistan. What we also know is that the fact, by definition, these firms, there's no data on them. So, reaching out to them is so much more complicated than reaching out to firms in the formal sector. Government of Pakistan, you mentioned Ahad, government of Pakistan rolled out almost a $7.5 billion package at the start of the crisis to support the private sector more generally. And at the same time, these fiscal measures were complemented by monetary measures announced by the State Bank, announced by CCP and other organizations. It entailed a reduction in the key policy rate, it entailed regulatory measures, and it also entailed the institution of a number of refinance facilities. The government of Pakistan went above and beyond, I think, to an extent, to support the private sector, in particular the informal sector. But what we know is that the vast majority of these schemes did not benefit the informal sector. What we know, also based off of a survey that the World Bank carried out a few months back, what we know is that the vast majority of this support went to firms that were operating in the formal sector. So the question is, now that we're in the midst of another wave, now that we know that this is going to be a long winter, what can the government do going forward to support the firms that are operating in the informal sector? In the short term, in the immediate term, what needs to be done, and I think this is something that Siddharth also alluded to, what needs to be done is, you need to give these firms liquidity support. You need to give them liquidity support so that they do not lose their organizational capital, whether it's tangible capital, in the shape of property, plant, and equipment, or whether it's intangible capital in the shape of, this intangible bond that these firms have with their employees. So the idea is to give them liquidity support that they need to survive the crisis, and that's particularly important because you want to preserve jobs. And as I mentioned earlier, this sector accounts for almost 90% of all the jobs in Pakistan, right? So you need to ensure that you preserve jobs, and at the same time, you also, by giving the support to these firms, you would also be ensuring that they're better primed to hit the ground running once the crisis abates. In the medium term, if you want to support the informal sector, in the medium term, what you need to do is you need to work on building their resilience. You need to work on their capabilities, and at the same time, you need to give them an enabling environment to basically seize the opportunities that are emerging in view of the COVID crisis. And Siddharth alluded to it, digitization and all these other things. So there is a structural transformation that's happening in the economy at a very rapid pace, at a pace which we have never seen before. And I think the government needs to seize this, and the government also needs to support the informal sector in seizing these new trends. So this is what the government can do, I think, in the short to medium term, to support the informal sector, weather the COVID crisis.
Rafe, if you allow, we can probably come back to you in the second round for you to finish off your these interventions, and now we can move to the next panelist, if you allow.
Sure, absolutely, that's fine. Yeah.
Yes. So our next panelist is Samar Hassan, and I will particularly ask her to comment on the gender aspects of this whole phenomena in the informal sector. As Dr. Pasha has already told us that 40% of the jobs lost were actually women, and I think women might be affected more than men in case of Pakistan. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. So over to you, Samar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aha. Thanks so much for extending the invitation as well. And thank you so much to all the panelists for their remarks before I am to go now. So it seems like a lot of the stuff has already been established, the kind of challenges that the informal economy faces. But just to reinstate, so obviously some of the statistics, they're different simply because they've been collected at different times or by different institutions. But I'm going to quote the Labor Force Survey 2017-2018, which states that the informal sector in Pakistan accounts for more than 70%, 71.7% of the employment and made jobs outside agriculture, more in rural areas than in urban areas. Now, out of that, obviously, like one of the gentlemen before me mentioned, cottage industry appears to employ a lot more women in the informal sector, who in turn are obviously much more affected by the lack of safeguards of labor rights, application of minimum wage, and of course, the minute COVID struck, all of us saw the people of Pakistan, the citizens of Pakistan, a lot of social enterprises, risk, etc., people coming together to extend relief packages, dispersing food packages, etc., ration bags to the informal economy. Obviously, the government as well, under a SAS program, established that minimum wage, people falling within the minimum wage, and about 10 million people would receive 12,000 rupees worth of money every month that would be dispersed to help them counter the impact of COVID. But now, obviously, this is something which is happening in COVID. It is something which is unprecedented, and something like this has come together by the government. Relief packages are being announced, etc. But what about the day-to-day informal economy? So I think some of the points which have been raised are absolutely critical. Decent work, deficits, challenges including rights at work, what sort of labor protection laws are applicable to the informal economy, and we know that practically none of that exists, especially when it comes to women, since the informal sector accounts for a lot of women who are employed in that particular sector. So of course, when you're talking about them giving birth, taking care of, having home responsibilities, having responsibilities to be the primary caregivers for older people in their households as well, automatically these are certain benefits which never extend to them, because the informal economy is not part of the formal economy. Now, the other aspect which I really want to highlight, because we also know that in the microfinance sector, which is not the best possible access to finance option available for the informal sector, again, women are by and large taking out a lot of these microfinance loans. So over here as well, there are serious issues when it comes to access to finance. Now let's talk a little bit about the informal economy, which is being run by home-based women entrepreneurs. So that's again a new category which is really, really growing. We've seen the huge transformation in Pakistan when it comes to e-commerce industry, and a lot of women now through platforms such as Facebook and through social, different e-commerce platforms, Daraz, etc. They have been contributing very heavily towards the economic growth of the country. However, they are still falling in the informal economy. So the problem that we were discussing, so there are all of these challenges, but now let's talk a little bit, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities which have come forth. So I think Siddharth was mentioning about digital transformation and how digital access, digital skills, enhancement of that, to my mind, that is one of the biggest things that the government, whether it's a provincial government or the federal government, needs to focus on. And obviously we've seen a lot of movement from the KP government, particularly, of course, there have been different freelancing programs in the background, but recently as well, just yesterday, I was noticing that there's again another cycle of digital skills enhancement which is being extended under the digital KP's digital youth program, youth empowerment program, something of that sort. So that is absolutely critical because the informal economy can benefit from the opportunities that COVID presents. They can go digital, they can sell digital. That becomes far, far easier. They can so obviously that's an opportunity. Now, within that opportunity lies a challenge as well. So on the one hand, how many of the informal economy workers actually know how to utilize best in the best manner possible the digital platforms that are available to them? So that is one big area where I think capacity building and enhancement needs to take place. On the other side, there is an internet divide, which again, this is something that we need to realize, that when we're talking about the informal economy, and we spoke right at the beginning that it is more in rural areas than in urban areas. So again, this poses, this creates an opportunity for the government actually, and to work with the telco providers, service providers, and make things easier for the informal economy operators. On the other side, one of the biggest issues which remains is digital payments. So in terms of digital payments, and I would like to talk now more about the startups as well, because startups, as Rafe was saying, so if you've got less than 10 employees, you're talking about the informal economy, and startups usually are working one people, two people teams, 2-member teams. So again, that's a big area where digital payments, it needs to be smoother, it needs to be faster. There are tons of restrictions right now. So 25,000 rupees transactions per day limits startups that are trying to scale, businesses that are trying to scale. And obviously they have to sometimes maintain 2 different accounts. So they're maintaining the Easy Pesa account, they're maintaining a digital, Jazz Cash account. They're trying to maneuver the system like this. So I think there are all of these issues which come into play when you start talking about, targeting the informal sector, which is also growing rapidly, right, under the startups and entrepreneurial space. In that regard, again, like I mentioned, so women entrepreneurs, so I think Ahad wanted me to highlight a little bit about their challenges as well. So several women entrepreneurs are actually operating and providing services or products which are more luxury items, right? So beauty, care, skincare, jewelry, fashion, clothing, etc., which obviously when a crisis like COVID hits, automatically they're taking a back seat and they're unable to, earn income. So I think one of the things which I think Rafe mentioned, right? So absolutely agreed, Rafe. I think that's a very valid point, that when we're thinking about incentives and we're thinking about policies and trying to create a fruitful, an enabling environment, we have to understand who we're trying to target. So if we're putting up the gender lens, we absolutely need to understand that access to finance is very difficult for women. Because of the collateral requirements, because of the requirement that they must have a male guardian come and sign off the papers for them, because of the fact that they have never really understood or studied. It's not about understanding; it's about studying or having access to financial literacy and financial training. So I think if you're trying to tackle all of these from a gender lens, you have to understand what are the key issues that these women are faced with. When it comes to digital technology, STEM fields, technology is something of a barrier for women entrepreneurs. So I think these are some of the interventions that I would like to talk about. I think I'm at 9 minutes, Ahad. So before you
Thank you.
tell me to stop
Thank
talking,
you.
I think
Thank you.
I'll stop right here.
Thank you. Thank you, Summer. And I think I'll definitely agree with most of the points you raised, but particularly about the digital divide. So now I go to my next panelist, with Mr. Abdul Qadir, who is an independent development sector practitioner. And over to you, sir. Sir, you're muted. Kindly unmute yourself. Yes, sir. We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very interesting. So we have 10 minutes here. I'll just, my job is very easy now because a lot of things have already been said, but particularly from Siddharth and also Samar Hassan has mentioned about gender issues. So I have to speak only on because I wanted to speak only on the topic of labor and how the perspective of labor from the informal economy. And that is where it is very important that you have to see that we are talking about the working people, and working people's perspective would be more dynamic than, let's say, given by statistics and given by analysis and models. It has to include economic processes. It has to include governance processes, political, social, cultural, and all these processes have to be integrated and see what is happening here. From the perspective of working people, what is informal worker? An informal worker is for them is where his or her rights or his or her human rights and labor rights are not recognized. That is that is the informal economy for the worker. We also need to just keep in mind that we always talk about informal as a sector. It's not a sector. In fact, the formal is a sector. The informal economy is where most of the population of the world work there, and especially in developing countries in South Asia, it is by definition and by default a informal economy. In fact, the informal economy, every economy at its origin is informal, and it has to be formalized. And this formalization process has been going on since last, say, 150, 200 years, how to formalize economy. So for informal economy, so informal workers, where workers' rights are not recognized. So informal economy is where no social rule apply and where the strong prevail by the virtue of their strength. And because they do not, and they prevail because they do not meet any organized opposition. So for a layman's jargon, that economy, when we talk about informal economy, it is basically informally an economy which is not organized. And thus you have to see that what kind of organization would work in such an economy. Well, it's easy. Then let's see that what's the social dominant social organization. For example, as our colleague Samar Hassan was mentioning about the gender presence in informal economy. So if it is a patriarchal society, it will be the working relationship, and work relationship will be patriarchal. If we talk about, so you see that in such informal economy, most of the workers are women workers numerically, and they are finding their subsistence job and low skill jobs. And when it start becoming profitable, the women are phased out, and then it doesn't into such economy. Minority, migrant workers, poorest of the society. So it depends on what kind of which are the dominant and which are the social groups which are the weakest group in the society, or rival groups in society. So I mentioned that the idea is to think about, let's say, one of the important characteristics of a informal economy would be to measure the labor force survey was also mentioned here, but working people, or let's say poverty, working ratio in the economy, in the employment, it's never reduced in the history of Pakistan. It has never reduced. In South Asia, it is continuously either stagnant or now this COVID situation has sharply risen there. So we have to talk about the, in terms of, how the poverty situation in the country is there. So that is directly connected to that what kind of economy we have. We also need to look into the into this poverty and poverty situation and employment situation and their connection. It is very important that people talk about employment without talking about the impact on human resource development, impact on the development of society. It can be, employment, like right now, Pakistan is not doing that in terms of, providing jobs, especially in some sectors like construction sector or export sector. So jobs are, in Faisalabad, workers are not easily available. Labor is not available. What does it mean? I mean, labor is not available. So labor is available, but what happened to labor that is employed there? Will there be any changes in their income level? Will there be changes in their, social mobility? Will there be any changes in the employment relationship? So the idea was that employment and work to or jobs to work for the growth and development of society. Informal economy is not the answer. And why informal economy prevails is then it is easier to understand that such jobs, such kind of economic structures, such kind of jobs, such kind of economic policies would only result in more profit, growth and more growth in profit and growth in more accumulation of wealth. So the informal economy, when we talk about how to improve the situation of people, working people there, the agenda is very clear. It's given. Agenda it's a global agenda. It's part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. It's part of the International Labour Organization agenda. I think it's the key agenda. It's called Decent Work Agenda, and how to promote decent work agenda in the informal economy. And it has to have its principles very clear. There's details, for example, in subsectors like sectors where women are employed, just already described in quite detail by colleague Sabir Hassan. But the principles are there. That it has to begin with certain principles. And first of all, it has to look into the diversity and characteristics and circumstances of workers and economic units in this informal economy, and the necessity to address such diversity with tailored approaches.
We're not able to hear you, Kadir Saab.
You have to see what kind of legislation that we need to improve. Pakistan is a very lucky country. Pakistan,
Maybe there is a connectivity. Kadir Saab, maybe there is connectivity issue. If you can put your video off, maybe then we might be able to hear you better.
Is that better now? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. It's much better.
Okay. So I was talking about that. What are the guiding principles for a formalizing economy? So our target is that we are problem with the formal economy. Jobs are not created in formal economy. Our policies are not developing in economy which is formalizing the economy and formalizing the jobs, formalizing the working conditions of the people there. So that what is the agenda? Agenda is decent work, and decent work agenda. I think I don't need to go into for more details there. It has to have some guiding principles. It has to, for example, countries would need to develop their own guiding principles depending on their own history and situation there and their own challenges. But there are certain standards. And standards are there, and as I mentioned, in Pakistan, the legal framework is not bad. Pakistan has done well in its initial parts of its history, especially in the first 3 decades. It has brought very good, legislation there. And next is also what kind of employment policies that we are doing. Employment policies directed to formalize the economy, directed to provide people growth, for example, human growth and human development growth. That would be, that kind of economic policies and politics would be important. How can we, for example, learn from other countries when we talk about the rights and social protection? Siddharth mentioned about the social protection. I think social protection is one of the key areas. In our countries, the informal economy, where the abuse of human rights and labor rights, flagrantly take place, it is directly also connected with the taxation policy. That's you will notice whenever you visit any formal enterprise or which is where informal economy and informal jobs are there, you already notice that how the taxation or revenue policy would be. It's already 10 minutes, but I'll just take 30 more seconds if I can.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Also, very important to just a minute. We have employment policies. We have to have a social protection and rights policy. So, for example, there are countries and examples, plenty of good examples coming up, that the social protection or social protection registration is connected with the revenue protection system in the country or tax collection system aspects. We talk about digital economy and technology. It's available there, so that we can connect it to make to avoid abuse and make the people accountable for their violation of people's rights and people's rights of true social protection. We need to incentivize informal economy to protect to compliance with the labor standards, and we have to ensure that enforcement should take place. And here we are talking about enforcement. People usually take it as a problem of governance. It's not a problem of governance when we talk about if you look into deeply. The governance problems, its defects are identified. But when it comes to informal economy, since it's the prevalent part of economy, we must look into the political structure of the economy, or the political economy. We should look into the critique of political economy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Last point. Just one more point. I just finished there because
Sure.
give you an example of my last point. Recently, our government prime minister and also Punjab government has gone to inspection-less regime. And what does it mean? Are you further already informalized economy? So this kind of political economy is really dangerous for formal economy and formalized economy and for the development of human resources in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will now give the stage to Mr. Hashim Raza, who is the CEO of Small and Medium Enterprise Development Authority and the panel chair here. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ahad. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay. I think what we have heard from the panelists and from our colleagues in the World Bank is consistent with what SMEDA's own work has been on the informal sector, especially in the wake of the COVID-19. For example, initially, Azime has shared her presentation on Karachi and what she talks about in terms of the factors leading towards informalization, the regulations, power supply, or decline in the urban infrastructure. Similarly, Siddharth from the World Bank, the job loss predominantly in the urban centers and more so in the smaller segment of the informal sector. Rafe has talked about heterogeneity and within the informality itself, and again, some of the observations were consistent with our own survey. SMEDA had done a survey on the COVID-19 impact on the SMEs, including the micro enterprises or the informal sector. Similarly, the gender disbalance, I think, needs no pointing. And as well as some of the points mentioned by Abdul Qadir Saab in terms of the incentives or the policies for the government to be able to formalize. Let me share with you, it seems like probably I'm the only panelist, and I also have the responsibility of concluding this from a government's perspective. And this is fresh from the oven in the sense that SMEDA was involved in articulating government's response to the informal economic sector. And just to sort of clarify, Ahad, what you have said earlier, there were two specific programs that the government launched to be able to cater to the liquidity needs in the informal sector. One was Mazdoor Ka Ehsaas, and as we speak, the total beneficiaries from that is 1.18 million, and the total disbursement that has taken place is 14.7 billion rupees, about $85 million, and that covered the labor in the informal sector as well as the self-employed. The other program that SMEDA helped the government to design was the electricity package, and that too was focused towards the very smaller segment of the enterprise holding commercial and industrial connections. So the very basic electricity consumption needs. And that program, the government had actually disbursed 50 billion rupees or something close to $310 million to the consumers of the basic, the commercial and industrial connections. So these two were the end. Since SMEDA and I myself was part of designing both these programs, I can share with you that once you extrapolate these policy and research recommendations from a government's perspective, what challenges does it create for us? And these are the challenges that we actually faced. And in some ways, actually, the COVID-19 was an opportunity for the government to realize that if they were to articulate a program for supporting this sector, what kind of challenges it might lead into. And some of those challenges, Rafe is a witness to it, were discussed in our interactions with the World Bank. Now, the 4 or 5 key areas that we thought are missing and the real challenge. One is data. Of course, we all know, just by the very definition of the informal sector, there is no data available. So in terms of planning or quantum of a program, the government really can't pick up a figure or allocate a budget. The second is identification. Even if you have the broad policy level, macro level data, how do you identify? These people are not on the radar, and they are not registered. Their identity information is not available anywhere. Number third is targeting. So even if you pass through somehow, maybe self-identification is one way of crossing the bridge of identification. But even if you pass through this, how do you target it? Because the numbers are so huge that you cannot give it indiscriminately for everyone. Number fourth is service delivery. I mean, how do you channelize funds, and make sure that those are available? 5 is avoiding misuse. In a country like Pakistan, how do you avoid misuse? And if we are talking of services other than funds, the service delivery part of it. So these are some of the challenges that we face. And therefore, we have to come across a program that was based on self-identification in the case of Mazdoor Ka Ehsaas, and rule-based in case of the electricity package. Now, finally, we see, I have heard a lot of recommendations in terms of formalization, but I think we have to understand carefully that in countries like Pakistan, we have not been able to balance the cost associated with formalization and the incentives that an enterprise will hope to receive as a result of it. So since that balance is not there, I think a blind approach towards formalization may not be the way to go. And if I were to rock the boat here, in terms of what has been said, we might need to look at very carefully in terms of the value created for the economy through formalization and the associated value loss as a result of both the compliance cost and the harassment cost and the management attention costs that are associated with the formal economy in Pakistan. So that has to be looked carefully. Now, my final, and before I give sort of a final take on this, let me play for a little time. And Ahad, if you can play the video without the audio of it, and let me explain what the challenges are. Can we play the audio? Okay, that's it. I think it gives the picture. So thank you. Now, this is an enterprise. We did a very small survey to see if the government can actually target a person like this who's operating 2 machines with his wife in his home without industrial connection, without commercial connection. He's not registered with FER. He's not registered with any association in Pakistan. He's not even literate to register himself. Now, my point is that the predominantly the informal sector comprises of enterprises like these, or maybe a notch above or a notch below. The real challenge is that while government would have to identify, collect data, bring them into a tech stack, provide some sort of incentives, we have to carefully see what benefit, what value it creates for that enterprise. And unless we have an answer to that, I think a blind approach towards formalization may not be the way to go. I mean, I do not have an answer to this, but may not be the way to go. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that while governments articulate their policy in terms of formalization, I think they have to look carefully in terms of the quantum of the sector that we are talking about. For example, in Pakistan, some estimates say 98% of all businesses are in informal sector. Similarly, if you look at jobs, there is a number that more than 70% of all private sector jobs out of agriculture are in the informal sector. So when you have a quantum like this, out of a total of estimated 5.2 million enterprises in Pakistan, what is really the incentive that the government can provide to ask them to come into formalization? And this is one of the challenges we are facing as we are now moving towards formalization of the SME sector, which is probably a notch above the complete informal sector. So I just leave all of you with these sort of challenges that, at least on the other side of the table, the policymakers and the government can face, and we have faced while we were designing the government's response to the COVID-19 challenge. But thank you once again for this opportunity. It has been excellent presentations by all the panelists and the points that have been discussed. We have noted them and will make sure that those are discussed with the government and the policymakers at appropriate forum. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I hope the different panelists have had a chance to look at some of the comments and questions that have been put in the chat box, and I think we have around 12 minutes left. So that means I think we can give each of you 2 to 3 minutes. So we can start off with Mr. Sharma.
Thank you, Ahad. Well, a lot of interesting questions, and of course the remarks by the panelists. So I want to thank all of them. I want to sort of speak a bit more about this last point that was raised by the Honorable Smita Chairman on is it about formalization or is it about the cost and benefits of formalizing? And I just want to underline and emphasize that our analysis also is in line with that. So it's not just important to reduce the costs of formalizing, but also to increase the benefits from formalizing. So and in fact, there have been many experiments around the impacts of simplifying business entry, so making it easier to formalize. And the results from these experimental studies are mixed. So sometimes it has an impact, sometimes it doesn't. And instead, we think that it's also important to think about how to increase the benefits to small firms from formalizing. And that could be due to better access to markets, better access to credit, better access to technology. So how can we associate all this with formalizing? And if this cost benefit changes, then the firms with the potential to grow will automatically formalize and grow. So perhaps that's a change in this approach is needed. That's it for me. Once again, thank you.
Thank you. And Rafe, if we can hear from you.
Thanks a lot, Ahad. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, phenomenal. So I think I'll take cue from the remarks that Hashim Saab made, his concluding remarks, and also take cue from the remarks that Siddharth made. I think I couldn't agree more with both Siddharth and Hashim Saab in that perhaps there's a need to take a more holistic and a more comprehensive view of what's driving informality in Pakistan, what can be done to reduce the share of the informal sector in the country. And I think there are 4 different dimensions, or perhaps 5 different dimensions that one needs to look at. I think Hashim Saab and Siddharth both mentioned cost and the benefits, but there's more to informality in Pakistan. I think as a starting point, and this is frontier research. This is coming out more recently on the informal economy around the world. I think as opposed to focusing on the costs and benefits, perhaps we need to focus on firm capabilities, because the idea is that if you build the capabilities of firms, you equip them with the tools, with the know-how, with the skill set to benefit from the formal economy, then they will formalize by themselves. So, it's not necessarily about institutional governance. It is to an extent. There's no denying that you need to reduce the cost. There's no denying you need to increase the benefits. There's no denying that you need to, for instance, make sure that firms that are operating in the formal sector have access to finance. But at the same time, you need to work more directly with the firms as well. You need to give them the skills they need to benefit from the formal economy. The other thing is, I think, also around data. This is Hashim Saab alluded to it. Hashim Saab mentioned now there's very little data that we have on the informal economy, or actually the economy more generally in Pakistan. So I think my humble suggestion would be for the government that we need to start thinking about the next economic census. I think that's perhaps the biggest gap insofar as the formal and informal sector is concerned, because the last one was carried out almost 2 decades ago. And if you want to actually do meaningful work around the informal economy or even the formal economy, then that's the fundamental, I think, starting point. So all in all, I think 3 principles which need to be taken into account when you're talking about informality. The first one is that you most certainly should not take a tax view to informality. That should not be your driving concern. The driving concern should be to boost the competitiveness and productivity of the firms and of the private sector that's operating in Pakistan. The second thing, which is also very important, is that you need to take an incremental approach. Firms that are operating in the informal sector will not overnight register with FPR. So perhaps the starting point, why don't you think about registering them with the municipalities and the local councils and other entities at the local level and the provincial level? So that's the second thing. And the third thing is, again, as I mentioned, a more comprehensive approach. You can't just focus on cost and benefits. You need to start thinking about firm capabilities, data, and so on and so forth, so other elements as well. So I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Rafe. So Samar?
Excellent points. Thank you very, very much. It has been a very enriching discussion. So just to add to that, right? So I think Siddharth was mentioning a few, very important points. Perhaps better rates for access to credit becomes easier for them, etc. But I would also like to talk about business development. So I don't know why automatically we always assume that people want to take credit. A lot of times people don't really want to take credit, and they would be able to not take credit if they had better understanding of cash flow management, if they had access to, other investment opportunities, for instance, right? Or simply business development opportunities. So what about working out procurement mechanisms which are easily comprehensible? And I'm specifically talking right now about women-led businesses and women enterprises. Why not focusing on that, right? And really assisting them so that they can enter into the formal economy. Well, when I say formal economy, so they can enter into the competitive process. The other piece that I feel is really, really important, this is something that, we've been working with KPITB on another project on outsourcing platform creation for SMEs, MSMEs, and startups, actually startups and MSMEs particularly. And again, the criteria which is there, 5 years of existence and so many years of, so much of capital and so many projects and volumes and etc. I mean, a lot of small businesses, you're barring them. You're barring them from the competitive process altogether. They're not going to be able to make money in decent fashion. Where are they going to file your taxes? And, why should they at the end of the day, right? So that's the question which comes up again and again. Why should I get registered? Because we work with startups. So they keep coming back to us and saying, well, why should we get registered? And if we are getting registered as a private sector organization, private limited, there are the amount of the procedural requirements are difficult to understand. They have to either engage a lawyer. Perhaps they're not so difficult to understand, except the simple, just fine print that's really, really tiny, right? So I remember in Urdu, they had translated it into Urdu, and I came back to them and I said, look, this is so small, nobody's going to be able to read it. So if you're putting it out there, it has to be legible, it has to be larger, etc. So I think those are important things to remember. Again, incentives for digitalization. So I think you can give them incentives to go and become, digital. And then again, financial literacy, I talked about it. I think trainings on those areas are really absolutely critical. So people are much more capable to take the right financial and other decisions for themselves.
So thank you. Abdul Qadir Saab, if you'd like to respond to any of the comments. Sir, you're muted, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, the formalization is not a switch over job, it's a transition process. And what we need to look into the different occupation. Informal sector is so diversified and so diverse that we have to look into what kind of occupation that we can do. I'll just give you an example. First is construction workers. And we know that what kind of key insecurities and key risks are there. There are irregular days of work, there are low and erratic earnings, there are hazardous work, there are frequent accidents and occasional deaths, occasional deaths. So there are lack of occupational health and safety measures, there are lack of accidents or disability insurance. So from the workers' perspective or labor's perspective or working people's perspective, engage in this sector, what would formalization mean to construction workers? And I think what we need to look into that, how can we provide more regular work to these workers? What kind of, what is the wage policy? What kind of, how do we manage higher wages? We're talking about the minimum wage and living wage, and there's a huge difference still in the countries of South Asia, but also in Pakistan. Sometimes the gap is as much as 40% of the living wage. So that kind of, so how to bridge that gap? The government has to intervene through social support program and housing and transportation and other essential costs which the state can provide there. Skill training to construction workers.
Thank you, Qadir Saab. We are really short on time because the next session is also about to start. So I'll give the floor to Hashim Raza Saab to close the panel with his final remarks.
Thank you very much, Ahad, and thank you very much, the panelists from World Bank, Samar, Qadir Saab. I think it has been an interesting discussion. We at SMEDA at least have benefited from it and noted as part of it, but I'll leave you with the same thought that I had expressed earlier. To in your endeavors, in your private places and in your research, to look at in the countries like Pakistan, where the government at times doesn't have the fiscal space to provide all the incentives it can for formalization, what can be possible measures? One. And secondly, if you look at a hybrid approach, so if they are completely informal, bringing it at least to the level where data on them is available, not them being formally in the business sector. This is something that SMEDA is looking at very carefully and will be very keen to work with you. So thank you very much once again. And finally, thank you to SDPI for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure seeing you and talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.